Tonight we journey into a sun-drenched, rum-soaked Havana, where the ocean breeze carries whispers of espionage and the palms seem to lean in conspiratorially. The year is 1959. You step off an imaginary plane into a pastel-painted city pulsing with revolution. The jazz clubs are still open, the mojitos still minty, but something is shifting beneath the surface. Somewhere in the mountains, a young man with a beard the size of a mop and charisma to match is beginning to rewrite Cuba's future. His name is Fidel Castro. And though you don't know it yet, the United States will soon try everything short of summoning a sea monster to make sure that future doesn't last. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your city and the time you're listening. I'd love to know where in the world you're winding down. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the hum of history under your feet as you walk along Havana's cobblestone alleys. Classic Chevys cruise by like floating tin canoes, and American jazz spills from corner cafes. It's a gorgeous place to lose yourself, but you're not here on vacation. The CIA is already watching this island like a jealous ex. Officially, America's worried about communism. Unofficially, they're also fuming over all the casinos, sugar farms, and oil refineries that have just been yanked away from American control like a lollipop snatched from a Wall Street toddler. Back in Washington, Eisenhower's administration is chewing its nails over Cuba's sudden left turn. They've seen what happened in China, they've seen what happened in Korea, and now right here, in their own metaphorical backyard, a guy with a degree in law and a flair for guerrilla warfare is cozying up to the Soviet Union like it's the prom and he's found his date. You remember the famous 26th of July movement? That's Castro's baby. What started as a ragtag rebellion quickly transformed into a well-oiled insurgency, helped along by his brother Raúl and that iconic motorcycle-riding doctor, Che Guevara. By New Year's Day of 1959, the Batista regime collapses like a flan in a hot car. Fidel marches into Havana not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol, a new dawn he claims for the Cuban people. The Cuban people, by the way, are both thrilled and terrified. Land reforms make some farmers cheer. Political purges make others vanish. But one thing's for sure, the bearded lawyer turned revolutionary is not here to play nice with Uncle Sam. And neither is Uncle Sam. By March 1960, President Eisenhower authorizes what the memo calls a program of covert action against Castro. That's polite bureaucratic speak for let's mess this guy up without starting World War III. Enter the CIA armed with cigars, scuba gear, and enough questionable ethics to fill a Cold War museum. The mission: remove Fidel Castro from power, preferably without leaving any fingerprints on the body. Spoiler alert, they will try and they will fail, repeatedly. But don't get ahead of yourself. You're still standing on the Malecon, that long seawall where ocean spray kisses the skin and lovers whisper secrets at dusk. A few blocks inland, in smoky backrooms and embassies, CIA operatives and Cuban exiles huddle over maps, photos, and dossiers. They're plotting sabotage missions, propaganda broadcasts, and even psychological warfare. It's less James Bond and more Looney Tunes, but with real consequences. And then there's Castro, always seemingly a step ahead, always with that smug smirk, like he's read the CIA playbook before they even printed it. Because in many ways he had. His network of informants and spies is tight. His intuition is sharper than the knife on a Cuban sandwich. Here's something fringe but true. One of the first rumors floating around Langley wasn't about killing Castro, but embarrassing him. One plan was to spray LSD in a radio studio while he spoke live on air, hoping he'd start babbling nonsense. Another involved a box of thallium-laced hair remover intended to make his beard fall out, believing that without his trademark facial fuzz, his public image would crumble like overcooked tostones. Historians still argue whether these were serious plans or just proposals that never made it past the wouldn't it be funny if stage. You glance across the harbour and spot a ship idling suspiciously. It's not the Bay of Pigs yet. That disaster is still over a year away, but you can already feel the tension curling like cigar smoke, thin, fragrant, and dangerous. Somewhere in a CIA office, a young operative named Richard Bissell is looking at a list of plausible deniability options. The list grows weirder by the weak infected wetsuits, exploding cigars, poisoned pens. But none of them, not one, has yet proposed turning a seashell into a murder weapon. That'll come later. For now, you take one last look at Havana. The sun's dipped below the horizon and the scent of salt and revolution lingers in the air. You don't know it yet, but the absurdity is just beginning. Because soon, very soon, the most powerful intelligence agency in the world will spend thousands of dollars, countless hours, and no small amount of political capital trying to kill a man with a seashell. You shift your weight on a creaky bar stool in some dim Cuban cantina, imaginary of course, but real enough in this sleepy retelling, and let the ambient noise swirl around you, dominoes clacking, the clink of glass, the low mutter of political jokes, shared only in safe company. The bartender has a pencil-thin moustache and pours rum like it's holy water. You sip, slowly watching the shadows, knowing full well that Havana is no longer a neutral stage, it's a front-row seat to history unfolding. With a cigarette in one hand and a .38 tucked in the waistband, Castro's revolution is now entrenched. The year is 1960 and he's moving fast. He nationalizes foreign-owned businesses. American corporations, Texaco United, Fruit, ITT, watch their Cuban assets disappear like a coin in a magician's sleeve. American diplomats pack their bags. Soviet advisors move in. You blink and suddenly Havana's become a glittering outpost of Marxist defiance just 90 miles from Miami. 90 miles. You could paddle that in a leaky kayak. Back in Washington, a new administration prepares to take over. Kennedy isn't president yet, but already the suits in Langley are in a panic. What started as cautious espionage under Eisenhower is about to become a theater of the absurd. Castro isn't just a leader anymore, he's a symbol the CIA wants to deface, defang, or disappear. At this point, the obsession isn't just about containment, it's personal. Castro taunts them on TV. He speaks in marathon-length speeches, waving his arms like a Shakespearean actor, calling out the Yankees and their laughable attempts to silence him. The CIA doesn't take kindly to being the punchline of a revolutionary's monologue, so they brainstorm, and boy do they brainstorm. You wander into one of those legendary Langley conference rooms, not literally, but close your eyes, and you'll smell the stale coffee and Cold War paranoia, and peek at the whiteboard. It's not labeled Ways to Kill Castro, but it might as well be. Someone's doodled a crude cartoon of a beard with an X through it. One of the earliest proposals lacing his favorite cigars with botulinum toxin. You know, the stuff that causes botulism. Yeah, the plan was to coat the inside of his signature smokes with enough poison to kill him in a single puff. The cigars were reportedly made, a box was prepared. But somewhere along the bureaucratic chain, the cigars vanished, misplaced, or quietly destroyed, depending on which agent you ask. Historians still argue whether the cigars ever even left US soil, or if they were a fantasy that never made it out of the briefing binder. Still, the idea of death by cigar is so poetically Cuban, so on-brand, that it sticks in everyone's imagination. Like something from a Bond movie, if Bond's gadgets were tested by interns and approved by lawyers. Then there's the infamous poisoned pen. This one's real. The idea was to rig a ballpoint pen with a tiny, hypodermic needle filled with Blackleaf 40, a super-concentrated nicotine derivative. You jab it into Fidel's hand or arm during a handshake or a document signing, and within minutes, poof, no more beard. The plan fell apart when the would-be assassin got cold feet. He looked at the pen, then looked at Castro and decided he liked breathing more than fulfilling his assignment. Can you blame him? You shift in your seat again as the cantina's ceiling fan squeaks overhead. In this haze of plots and paranoia, you realize the bearded revolutionary has become a kind of Rorschach test for the CIA. Every agent sees something different. Some want to assassinate him outright. Others think humiliation might be enough. Here's where things get properly weird. Someone proposes a thallium-laced shampoo. Thallium, you see, causes hair to fall out in clumps. The idea stripped Castro of his iconic beard and his thick mane, believing his supporters will see him as just another bald bureaucrat. Because clearly, in the eyes of the CIA, nothing says your revolution is over like a clean shave and a bad scalp day. Historians debate the seriousness of this plot. Was it ever attempted? Was the shampoo ever delivered? Was there a test dummy? Maybe some unlucky intern who went bald in the name of freedom? No one agrees. But the proposal exists etched in declassified documents like a Cold War fever dream. But here's a little-known tidbit. The CIA also considered dosing Castro with LSD. Imagine Fidel mid-speech 2 hours into one of his record-breaking orations, suddenly seeing the Cuban flag melt, or imagining his podium turning into a sea turtle. That too was a real idea floated by a mind so convinced of its brilliance, it forgot that psychedelics and geopolitics rarely make good dance partners. You glance toward the docks again. The fishing boats bob in the dark water, and you wonder if any of them ever carried agents' arms or maybe a wetsuit lined with tuberculosis bacteria. Yes, that was another plot. The CIA knew Castro loved scuba diving. They figured they'd gift him a diving suit infected with a fungus that would cause a slow, incurable skin disease, a literal slow burn. But like so many ideas on the board, it fizzled. You feel the pattern now. For every bizarre assassination plot, there's an equally strange failure. Plans that required precision kept unraveling under the weight of reality. The agents were often undertrained. The tools were unreliable. And Castro, he was frustratingly alive, always speaking, always smirking. You sip the last of your imaginary rum and listen to the fan. You understand now that the CIA wasn't just trying to kill a man, they were trying to kill an idea. The idea that one defiant island led by one stubborn man could stare down a global superpower with nothing but charisma cigars and a parade of awkward mustaches. And yet Castro lived, he endured. The Seashells, not yet, but soon. You're still lounging in that humid haze of Havana's ghostly cantina, when suddenly you feel the tone shift. You're no longer in the land of mischievous shampoo or psychedelic speeches. Now you're stepping into something bigger, something with funding, Operation Mongoose. It even sounds like a Saturday morning cartoon, except this one had bombs, double agents, and enough secret compartments to fill a Bond villain's mansion. You don't know it yet, but this is where the Seashell plot begins to crawl up from the sand. It's November 1961. John F. Kennedy, barely a year into his presidency, has just emerged from the stinging embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. You remember that, right? That time, the CIA trained a bunch of Cuban exiles, handed them some outdated maps, and dropped them onto a beach, hoping they'd topple the Cuban government by dinner. Instead, they got trounced by Castro's forces in less than 3 days. If the CIA was cocky before now, it was cornered and humiliated. Kennedy is furious, not because he wasn't warned, but because the whole thing was a masterclass in bureaucratic hubris. So what does he do? He doubles down, but quietly. You find yourself peering into a secret meeting room in the White House where Kennedy, his brother Robert, yes, Bobby Kennedy, and a rotating cast of intelligence honchos draft the plan that becomes Operation Mongoose. It's not just an operation, it's a full-on campaign. A shadow war. This is the CIA off the leash. Headed by General Edward Lansdale, a man who once spread rumors of vampire attacks in the Philippines to win a psychological war. Mongoose quickly becomes a circus of sabotage, bribery, and espionage, so tangled even the agents had trouble keeping track of which plots were real and which were internal rumors. The mission removed Castro from power within 12 months. The budget practically bottomless. The tactics, whatever could be plausibly denied in front of Congress. You lean in, feeling the madness warm your cheeks like a Havana breeze. You imagine this web of activity like a control panel levers, labeled things like arms smuggling, industrial sabotage, broadcast disruption, and assassination. The CIA pulls all of them. They blow up factories. They try to poison crops. They scatter propaganda leaflets across Cuban farmland via balloon drops. They even contemplate contaminating sugar shipments with deadly bacteria, then change their minds when someone wisely points out that maybe mass murder doesn't look great on a Senate report. You pause for a moment because here comes a weird little nugget. One mongoose sub-operation involved planting explosive devices in the ore-carrying shoes of a Cuban diplomat. Shoes. Historians still scratch their heads over this one. How exactly was that supposed to play out? He takes off his loafers, and boom. The logic seems thinner than a Cuban cigar wrapper. Meanwhile, over in Langley, someone begins crafting a whole department within the operation, lovingly titled Task Force W. The W didn't stand for weird, though it probably should have. It handled all things Castro, including the assassination plots that weren't even whispered aloud in front of most of the Kennedy administration. Here's where things get genuinely confusing, like conspiracy board with red yarn confusing. Operation Mongoose wasn't just one thing, it was 1,000 things. Some were real, some were ideas floated in memos, others were jokes that got filed like real plans, only to be discovered years later by bewildered historians. It's like the CIA became a parody of itself, but kept signing the checks anyway. And in the midst of this chaos, you begin to see patterns. Castro didn't just survive these attempts, he thrived in their shadow. Every failed plot added to his legend. Every absurd plan, be it beard removal, seashell bombs, or exploding cigars, made him more mythical, more untouchable. Even Cuban exiles started raising eyebrows. One, a man named Rolando Cubela, codenamed Amlash, agreed to carry out an assassination, but only if the US gave him direct proof that the plan was sanctioned by someone at the highest level. Bobby Kennedy eventually authorized the delivery of a pen syringe to Cubela, but the pen never reached his hand. The whole thing unraveled in whispers. Back at the CIA, they start losing track. One former agent later confessed that so many assassination plots were proposed, half the office couldn't tell if something was a real operation or just a recycled cartoon. And yet the drive remained. Castro must fall. And if not by explosion or poison, then by humiliation, or confusion, or mollusk. You might be wondering why so many people signed off on this. The answer is as American as it is, Cold War classic fear. Fear of the domino effect. If Cuba could go red, why not Guatemala? Why not Venezuela? Why not, eventually, New York? And let's not forget the Soviets. Khrushchev was just beginning to flirt with the idea of putting nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. Castro and the Kremlin were becoming pen pals. You're not even at the Cuban Missile Crisis yet, but you can feel the chill forming like dew on a glass of Havana Club rum. Here's the scholarly debate floating quietly like a forgotten file folder. Did the absurdity of these plots undermine American credibility more than Castro ever could have on his own? Did the spectacle of trying to kill a man with sea creatures and pharmaceuticals make the US look less like a superpower and more like a desperate flailing actor in a bad comedy? There's no clear answer. But you watch as Operation Mongoose, despite all its ambition, begins to sag under its own weight. Too many moving parts, too many absurd proposals, too few results. And then, as if summoned from the ocean itself, someone brings up an idea. Castro likes to scuba dive. What if we used that? What if we made it lethal? The seashell is coming. You don't remember who first said it out loud, but someone in Langley definitely did. Maybe it was a serious suggestion. Maybe it started as a joke. Maybe the line between the two had already blurred by then. Either way, the moment is real. What if we kill him with a seashell? You blinked. Did you hear that right? Yes, a seashell. The kind that sits harmlessly on beach towels or clinks around in souvenir jars. But in this particular fever dream of the Cold War, the CIA imagined it could become a tool of surgical assassination. Now picture the setup. You're in a grey-walled office, probably somewhere in the bowels of the CIA's Technical Services Division. Engineers, chemists, and a few men in suits hover around a table, staring down at a model of what might be described as a particularly flamboyant clam. The idea: build a large, brightly coloured shell, something so exotic, so visually stunning, that it would beg for attention. And when Castro, during one of his beloved scuba dives, inevitably swam over and picked it up, the device would detonate. You hear the ocean now, don't you? Imagine Fidel slicing through clear Caribbean waters in his wetsuit, his beard hidden beneath a snorkel mask, floating inches above the coral reef. He was an avid diver. That part's not rumor. He genuinely loved it. It was his escape. Even his mistress at the time, Marita Lorenz, would later say that diving was one of the only times he seemed truly relaxed. And here's the chilling twist: the CIA knew this. They had his schedules, his routines. They knew what beaches he liked, what reefs he preferred. They even knew what brand of diving gear he used. All of this became the raw material for an idea so absurd, it circled back around into plausibility. The plan was detailed, maybe too detailed. The shell had to be big enough to hide explosives, but not so big that it looked unnatural on the reef. It needed to be colorful, but not garishly fake. It had to be placed carefully, not tossed around by currents. And crucially, it had to detonate when disturbed, because remote detonation underwater, not so easy in 1960-something. You lean closer to that imaginary table, peering at the blueprints. The shell would be packed with a powerful charge, rigged with a motion-sensitive trigger, or perhaps a contact switch. The materials had to resist saltwater corrosion, survive underwater pressure, and oh yes, remain undetected by Cuban counterintelligence. Not a small ask for what is essentially a decorative sea bomb. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some reports claim that CIA operatives actually consulted marine biologists to figure out what kind of shell would look enticing yet plausible in Cuban coastal waters. Not too rare, not too common. Just tempting enough. Imagine that phone call. "Hi, yes, I'm with a government agency. We're wondering what type of mollusk Fidel Castro might find aesthetically pleasing while snorkeling near Cayo Blanco." But wait, it gets better. The plan never got off the drawing board. Historians still argue why. Some say the technical requirements were too complex. Others suggest that the idea was deemed too ridiculous even by Cold War standards. And some believe the operation was abandoned because Castro's diving habits shifted. He stopped going to that particular reef or tightened his security detail. Either way, the explosive seashell, like so many other CIA projects, was quietly shelved. Still, the idea lingers like chlorine in the air. It becomes a symbol, not just of desperation, but of imagination warped by obsession. The CIA's fixation on Castro had passed the event horizon. They weren't just trying to remove a threat. They were throwing darts in the dark, hoping one would hit the man-shaped outline somewhere on the Caribbean map. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, Castro remained very much alive and somehow always a few steps ahead. You begin to suspect that he knew about many of these plots, or at least suspected them. In fact, in later interviews, he claimed that he was told about the exploding seashell plot by Cuban intelligence. Whether that's true or just retroactive myth-building is anyone's guess, but it fits the legend, the bearded man who survived hundreds of assassination attempts and kept making jokes about them on live television. And make no mistake, this wasn't the only underwater plot. The CIA also considered giving Castro a contaminated diving suit laced with bacteria and fungus stored in a diving gear bag and left for him to find. Another idea: sprinkle LSD into his air supply. Imagine swimming along the reef and suddenly being greeted by rainbow-colored fish that start whispering CIA secrets. It's funny until you remember people were paid full government salaries to develop this stuff. You sit back and take it in. The Cold War wasn't just a conflict of ideologies, it was theater, it was performance. The Soviets had ballet and parades, America had exploding shellfish and invisible ink. And right in the middle, Fidel Castro swimming in circles, unknowingly dodging death disguised as sea decor. So where does that leave you? Floating in the turquoise waters of history, somewhere between disbelief and resignation. The exploding seashell never exploded. Castro lived to 2016, but the file exists. The plan was real. And once you've reached the point where mollusks are in your kill budget, maybe it's time to rethink your strategy. You're still drifting just beneath the turquoise waves, imagining the ocean floor of 1960s Cuba, soft sand, gentle currents, and somewhere supposedly highly decorated seashell with murder on its mind. But let's surface for a moment. Because while the exploding mollusk was perhaps the most theatrical proposal in the CIA's tropical toolkit, it was far from the only attempt to weaponize the sea. You dry off under a palm tree as another file folder opens one filled with sketches and notes that read more like the props list from a rejected James Bond film than official US intelligence planning. After the Seashells' quiet shelving, the CIA didn't fold its fins and call it quits. No, it doubled down on the marine theme. If they couldn't lure Castro to an exploding conch, maybe they could sabotage his next dip in the sea another way. That's when the infamous infected wetsuit idea resurfaced. You remember it from the last section. Here's how it supposedly went. Knowing that Castro frequently borrowed diving equipment when he wasn't using his own, the CIA cooked up a plan to offer him a gift wetsuit. This wasn't your standard issue neoprene. No, this one was carefully treated with a fungus designed to cause a debilitating skin disease and a bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis to be precise, that could potentially infect his respiratory system. A silent, slow and deniable death, or at least that was the idea. The suit, like the seashell, was reportedly prepared. Sources say it was even delivered to a contact close to Castro, possibly Rolando Cubela, the same exile involved in the poisoned pen plot. But again, the plan fizzled before it could float. Some reports claim the suit was never passed along. Others say Castro simply declined the gift. Historians, as always, disagree. Did the suit really exist? Was it a theoretical draft or a rubbery death trap collecting mold in a Langley closet? We may never know. Still, the sea remained an irresistible theme. And it wasn't just the setting, it was the symbolism. Water was where Castro felt free, relaxed, unwatched. And so the CIA reasoned, if they could strike him there, they wouldn't just be assassinating a man, they'd be violating a sanctuary. You imagine the agents scribbling on legal pads in DC, each brainstorming session another round of mental twister. One memo even suggested using a special starfish mine, an underwater explosive shaped like a living creature. A mine that, if seen by a curious diver, would be indistinguishable from nature until it detonated. Why was this never built? Possibly because even the most paranoid analysts realized that placing sea mines near a leader's private beach might start a very public war. But maybe the strangest underwater idea didn't come from Langley at all. Around this time, the Office of Naval Intelligence reportedly floated the notion of training dolphins to deliver explosives to enemy divers. You know, just in case Flipper wanted to join the fight against communism. That plan, while more long-term and less Cuba-specific, highlights the flavor of the era. If it lived in the ocean and could be trained, painted or stuffed with TNT, someone somewhere was willing to file the paperwork. You walk along the shore now not as a tourist, but as a witness to a Cold War arms race that occasionally substituted brains for barnacles. And still, none of it worked. Castro kept diving. He kept governing. He kept laughing, especially at the absurdity of it all. Here's your fringe fact of the evening. In later years, Cuban intelligence officials, some of whom defected, claimed that they knew about many of these underwater plots in real time. Some say they even allowed the CIA to continue certain operations just to monitor their methods. Whether that's true or simply Cold War chest-puffing remains uncertain, but the possibility adds another surreal layer. Imagine Castro slipping on a wetsuit and chuckling, "Let's see what they've come up with this time." He wasn't wrong to be wary. The ocean was only one arena. On land, the ideas kept piling up, but here under the water you can't help but marvel at the desperation. These weren't just plans, they were cries for relevance. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, after diplomatic humiliation, the CIA had become a jilted empire in need of a win. Any win, even one involving coral and explosives. And yet nothing in the sea ever struck. No shell ever went boom, no wetsuit ever infected, no dolphin ever carried out a deep-sea bombing mission. The only thing that exploded was the mythos. The CIA's aquatic antics became a cocktail of fact and farce. A prism through which every Castro story now shimmered, no matter how outlandish. Did the man really have 27 near-death experiences? Did his beard really deflect bullets? Or did his enemies just run out of reasonable ideas? What's undeniable is the pattern. By this point, assassination attempts had become not just military strategy but a genre of their own, and the ocean always shimmering in the background was the perfect setting, seductive, mysterious, and above all, plausible. If you were going to build a legend, you might as well do it underwater. So now, as you look out across the reef, you wonder, was it ever about killing Castro, or was it about trying again and again in increasingly bizarre ways because trying was the only thing left? The seashell never exploded, but it's still echoing. Now you wade even deeper, not into the sea, but into Fidel Castro's own world. Because while the CIA was drawing blueprints of exploding clams and infected wetsuits, Castro was slipping into flippers, strapping on a mask and plunging into the ocean like it was his second home. He wasn't just a fan of diving, he was borderline obsessed, and that made him vulnerable. Or at least the CIA hoped so. You feel the pull of the reef. Picture it, calm, shallow waters off Cayo Blanco or the Isle of Youth, the sunlight filtering down like gold dust through the waves. There goes Fidel gliding along the coral with practiced ease, speargun in hand, eyes scanning the rocks for grouper. Not a bodyguard in sight. Just him, the fish, and a few rays flapping past like lazy underwater birds. This wasn't just recreation. For Castro, diving was a statement, a message that he wasn't afraid. While the US trembled behind its nuclear arsenals and labyrinthine conspiracies, he was out here swimming with the sharks, sometimes literally. His image as the fearless gorilla extended into the water. He knew people were watching, he liked it that way. But not all eyes were friendly. Back in Langley, a diver's solitude was a CIA analyst's dream. No crowds, no political fallout, no collateral damage. Just one man, one reef, and ideally one beautifully booby-trapped shell. You can see why the seashell idea caught on, but you also begin to understand why it failed. Because Castro wasn't careless, Cuban intelligence had built up a sophisticated counter-surveillance program. Even during leisure time, the man had layers of protection. His gear was checked, his movements tracked. He dove with military-trained companions. The idea that he'd stumble upon a random radioactive rainbow seashell and go, "Oh, what a lovely find," was a fantasy only someone at a desk far from the sea could conjure. Still, it didn't stop them from trying, or planning, or scheming. Meanwhile, the myth of Castro the diver was growing. He gave interviews about it. Photos circulated of him in diving gear. The man was turning into a Cold War action figure, AK-47 in one hand, snorkel in the other. And every image like that was a dart in the CIA's side, because every time he surfaced from a dive, it meant they'd failed again. The clock kept ticking, the funds kept flowing, but Fidel kept breathing. You tilt your head and think maybe that's why the plans grew stranger over time. Not just desperation, but spite. They didn't just want to stop him. They wanted to trick him, to mock him. The exploding shell wasn't just a weapon, it was a metaphor. Here, Fidel, enjoy this gorgeous gift from the sea. Boom. But it was also a gamble on human nature. The whole plot hinged on one moment of curiosity. One flash of color. One split-second lapse from a man whose survival instincts were famously sharp. And that's where it unraveled. Because let's face it, when you're a world leader with dozens of confirmed threats against your life, you don't just grab the first pretty thing you see underwater. You don't sniff the flowers, you don't bite the candy, and you sure as heck don't touch mystery seashells that weren't there yesterday. Still, the idea got far enough to reach the drawing board. And that's saying something, because inside the CIA plots had to pass through channels, technical feasibility reports, budget requests, risk assessments. Somewhere along the way, a government official, probably in a blazer, probably sipping lukewarm coffee, read a line that said, "Proposal explosive seashell for use against Fidel Castro," and didn't laugh it out of the room. Here's your mainstream fact for the night. Between 1959 and the late 1970s, the CIA admitted to, or was credibly accused of, over 600 plots against Fidel Castro. 600. Everything from sniper rifles and car bombs to sabotaged cigars and femme fatales. Most failed before they started. Others fell apart mid-execution. A few were outright farce, but they were all real proposals recorded in official documents, whispered about in Senate hearings, and pored over by scholars for decades. And scholars still argue about how serious the Seashell plot really was. Was it merely an idea scribbled on the corner of a memo, or did it go into full prototype? Some say yes, some say no. Some claim it never left the lab. Others swear it was dropped into the sea, waiting like a colourful landmine. It's the kind of mystery that keeps Cold War historians up at night, thumbing through redacted PDFs and wondering if the truth was lost to saltwater and time. But here's your quirky nugget. Castro loved talking about the plots. In interviews, speeches and memoirs, he'd casually mention assassination attempts like you'd mention odd weather. One day, it was exploding cigars. Another, it was contaminated milkshakes. And yes, he eventually brought up the seashell. He laughed. The whole room laughed. They even tried to get me with a shell, he said once. And everyone chuckled, not because it wasn't serious, but because it was so absurdly serious. And that's where the real power lay, not in the failure of the plots, but in their ridiculousness. Castro didn't just outlive the CIA's operations, he owned them, wove them into his legend, like scars you show off at parties. He became the man who could survive anything, not just bullets, but bad ideas. So you float there, suspended in saltwater memory, wondering maybe the seashell was never about the kill. Maybe it was about what it revealed. A world power so afraid of one man's defiance, it weaponized mollusks. And still Fidel dove on. You sit now beneath a lazy ceiling fan in the CIA's own fever dream, thumbing through a deck of how to kill Fidel cards that reads more like rejected plots from a satire skit than declassified intelligence. But this is real, or real enough that entire departments were created just to track it, because exploding seashells weren't even the weirdest part. No, this was just one glittery pearl in an entire oysterbed of Cold War chaos. Let's pull back and peek at the rest of the clams. You move beyond the ocean and wade into the land-based attempts, a territory equally absurd and infinitely more desperate. One of the earliest lacing Castro's favorite cigars with botulinum toxin. We touched on this, remember? But here's the kicker: they actually manufactured them. They really did coat cigars with enough poison to make a grown man collapse mid-inhale. The idea was so poetic, death via Havana's signature export, that it might have gotten greenlit on aesthetics alone. But as with most CIA attempts, something went wrong. The cigars disappeared. Historians still don't know if they were destroyed, intercepted, or accidentally smoked by someone with a death wish. Then came the exploding cigar. Not to be confused with the poisoned one, this one was supposed to detonate the moment it was lit, like a birthday prank from hell. That plan died on the vine, probably because even the CIA had to admit the optics of blowing a man's head off with his own trademark accessory might raise a few eyebrows at the United Nations. But they didn't stop there. Oh no. Let's talk about the infamous femme fatale. Her name was Marita Lorenz, and she was one of Fidel's former lovers. The CIA recruited her, convinced she'd help bring him down. They gave her pills, tiny cyanide capsules, to drop into his drink. Sounds foolproof, right? Except it wasn't. She got to Havana. She saw him. He smiled. She melted. She confessed. And in perhaps the most Cuban twist imaginable, he handed her a pistol and said, "If you're going to kill me, do it now." She couldn't. She never did. Now that's drama. The CIA also considered rigging a radio studio with LSD. Remember that? The idea was to dose Castro mid-speech live on air. They hoped he'd hallucinate, babble nonsense, or maybe confess that communism was just a phase. Why didn't they go through with it? Because getting LSD through Cuban security required a level of stealth they clearly didn't possess. Also, there's always the chance he would have just delivered an even more charismatic speech with talking dolphins. You smile because it's funny until you remember these weren't jokes to the people planning them. These plots were written up, budgeted, tested. Millions of dollars flowed through the pipes of American intelligence for ideas like exploding pens, toxic scuba gear, and contaminated milkshakes. One plan even included rigging the air vents in his TV studio with chemicals that would make him sound high-pitched and ridiculous, as if humiliation were the sharpest knife in the drawer. And the beard, always the beard. Agents obsessed over it. There was something psychological about it. Castro's beard was iconic, defiant, and a symbol of revolutionary ruggedness. The CIA assumed that if they could make it fall out, it would destroy his mystique. So they proposed sabotaging his shaving cream, his toothbrush, even his laundry detergent. One suggestion involved dusting his shoes with thallium salts so his skin would absorb them and he'd start shedding like a communist cat. That's not speculation, that's from a declassified memo. You may wonder why such fixation, why such creative fury? Because Castro wasn't just a threat. He was a theatrical, media-savvy, frustratingly untouchable threat. He survived the Bay of Pigs. He stood strong through the Cuban Missile Crisis. He rode into speeches on tanks and gave interviews with a cigar in one hand and a rooster in the other, literally. Once, when asked about CIA plots, he joked, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." And maybe that's what pushed the CIA to madness. Each failure turned into a punchline, each untriggered bomb into a myth. The US was supposed to be the master of covert action, but somehow Fidel, with his unfiltered charm and army green fatigues, was flipping every plot into propaganda. In surviving, he became immortal. Here's a fringe gem for you. One internal CIA document allegedly proposed giving Castro a diving mask coated with a substance that would distort his vision and disorient him underwater. Because yes, even his goggles were seen as a battleground. That idea never made it past the early planning phase, but it speaks volumes. The man couldn't even swim without someone in Washington whispering, "Can we make him see jellyfish that aren't there?" And historians, they're still arguing. Some insist the CIA knew most of these ideas were nonsense. Others believe there was genuine intent behind each plot. Some say it was just a psychological operation, keep Fidel paranoid, distracted. Others claim it was a theater of delusion, a ritual of failure played out by men who couldn't admit they'd lost the plot. You sit with that tension now. Because in the end, the beard stayed full, the lungs stayed clear. The man who danced with sharks and mocked superpowers remained upright long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse. The irony? The man who outlived 6 US presidents and 1,000 Cuban cigars died peacefully in 2016, old and unassassinated. And somewhere you imagine a perfectly painted seashell sits beneath the sand, unexploded, unclaimed, and forever symbolic of an era that mistook cleverness for clarity. You lean back now, watching as the curtain begins to lower on the CIA's wettest, weirdest assassination chapter. The seashell lies somewhere in the lore of Cold War absurdity, a relic of all the plans that never quite happened, and yet somehow defined the era more than the ones that did. But Fidel Castro, he's still here, still speaking, still smirking. And that makes you wonder, how exactly did he always stay one splash ahead? You trace your finger along a timeline of foiled plots, shredded memos, and cancelled missions. And as you connect the dots, a pattern emerges not just of US failure, but of Cuban resilience. Because while the CIA was busy stuffing mollusks with C4, Cuban intelligence was building one of the most effective counter-espionage networks in the hemisphere. Here's your mainstream fact. Castro's security service, the Dirección de Inteligencia (DGI), was trained with Soviet help and modeled in part after the KGB. It had ears in every room, eyes on every expat, and a suspicious glare for every foreign visitor. Fidel, who once said revolution is the sense of the historical moment, understood the power of paranoia and weaponized it better than anyone. You imagine a different room now, not Langley, but somewhere in Havana. Dim lighting, file cabinets, a large wall map with strings and pins. This is where Cuban officials mapped their understanding of CIA activities. It wasn't just defense, it was judo. If the CIA turned cigars into weapons, Fidel turned them into punchlines. If they offered scuba gifts, he tightened security around his fins. Over time, the Cuban regime didn't just survive these attacks, it digested them, studied them, and grew stronger from the rehearsal of facing death and still standing. And the thing is, Castro played the long game. He knew that when a superpower swings this wildly, eventually it trips over its own shoelaces. The more outrageous the plots, the more absurd the headlines. Soon, Castro didn't have to defend himself, he just had to tell the truth. They tried to kill me with a seashell, he'd say, and people laughed. and that laughter was a shield stronger than any body armor. Let's pause on a quirky moment in 2000 long. After the Cold War had technically ended, Castro flew to Panama. A plot to kill him with explosives again was uncovered, and the agents involved were caught and arrested. By then, Castro was in his 70s, and yet the attempts still came. At a press conference, he leaned into the mic and said, "After so many attempts on my life, I no longer fear death. I expect it to get tired first." That line belongs in a museum. You notice something now. Castro didn't just outlast the plots, he incorporated them into his identity. Every assassination attempt, whether real or rumored, added bricks to the fortress of his legend. He was no longer just a revolutionary. He was the man death couldn't catch. He was the beard that couldn't be shaved, the lungs that couldn't be poisoned, the diver who never touched the shell. And so as the Cold War aged and eventually cracked, the US began to reevaluate its tactics. Assassination fell out of fashion, at least publicly. Congressional hearings exposed the dirty laundry. The Church Committee in 1975 revealed a long list of covert actions, including Castro plots that shocked the American public. Senators sat stone-faced as witnesses recounted schemes involving poisoned pills, exploding cigars, and yes, even those cursed seashells. You picture one of those hearings. The room heavy with wood paneling and political discomfort. Questions like, did we really attempt to kill a foreign leader with a trick mollusk met with uncomfortable silence or classified excuses? The truth had become a liability. And yet historians still don't agree. That's your scholarly debate tonight. Were these plots really greenlit all the way up the ladder? Or were they the fever dreams of mid-tier agents scribbled on the backs of napkins and mistaken for actionable plans? The lack of records, the redactions, the layers of bureaucratic misdirection, all of it leaves more mystery than resolution. But for Fidel, the facts didn't matter. The story was enough. He wove it into the Cuban narrative, fed it to his speeches, used it to rally allies and to ridicule enemies. The very attempts meant to end his rule instead became tools to extend it. And you have to admit it's hard not to be impressed. Whether you admire or oppose him, the sheer survival is a feat of its own. 6 decades of power, 600 alleged plots, and he left this world not in a flash of explosives or a cloud of toxins, but peacefully in bed with the legacy of a man who outlasted the imaginations of his would-be killers. You return now to that seashell. It never exploded, but in a way it worked. It blew up the credibility of the CIA, it detonated the illusion of invincibility, and it scattered pieces of truth and absurdity across the ocean floor of modern history, where we still dive today trying to collect them. Because maybe the greatest punchline of all is this: for decades, the most powerful nation on earth tried everything to silence one man. And in doing so, they gave him the best stories. You find yourself now drifting above the entire stage like a sleepy satellite looking down at a Caribbean-sized punchline. The sea, the cigars, the poisons, the pills, it all starts to feel like a surreal montage stitched together by a playwright who drank too much coffee. But this wasn't fiction. This was the Cold War, and assassination had become its most absurd theater. The United States and Cuba weren't just locked in a power struggle, they were performing. Every failed plot was a script flipped, and no one played their part better than Fidel Castro, the revolutionary turned myth, the man who dodged bullets and bombs with the ease of a magician slipping out of handcuffs. You think back to the CIA, America's supposed bastion of cloak and dagger excellence. By the 1960s, it had morphed into something else entirely, a bureaucracy of imagination. For every standard surveillance mission, there seemed to be 2 or 3 meetings on exotic sea creatures and toxic grooming products. And behind it all, a growing sense of impotence. Because each time they missed, each time Castro showed up on TV grinning with his beard intact, it wasn't just a tactical failure, it was humiliation. It made the US look petty, desperate, uncreative in a way that was somehow too creative. And now you see it wasn't just about Castro anymore. These plots were reflections. mirrors of a geopolitical moment in which anxiety had outrun logic. The Cold War had taken on a life of its own, with plots stacking upon plots, some so tangled that even those involved couldn't keep track of what was real and what was brainstorming gone rogue. There was a proposal, for instance, to use a kind of LSD mist during one of Castro's public appearances, hoping he'd melt down live, his words slurring into nonsense. Another idea: create a fake apparition of the Virgin Mary over Havana to trigger religious panic. Even seasoned agents started asking, "What are we doing here? This isn't spycraft, it's stand-up." And Castro, he watched it all unfold from a balcony view. Some stories say he kept a folder in his office marked "Attemptos fallidos," failed attempts. He collected them like baseball cards. Every new idea was another notch in his mythology. Exploding cigars. Yes, I remember that one. Poisoned wetsuits. They forgot I always used my own. And that seashell. Nice colors, he might have said. But I don't pick up trash. Here's your quirky tidbit. Many of these ideas didn't even make it to the testing phase because the materials weren't available or the science didn't check out. The infamous poisoned pen syringe. It was reportedly too fragile to use in the field. The beard removal shampoo, useless in Cuba's humidity. The exploding conch, too hard to camouflage without giving away the game. A bomb that looks too good might as well have a flag sticking out of it labeled, "Hey Fidel, pick me up." And yet these projects live on. Why? Because documents survive, because the Cold War loved to keep receipts. And when they were finally unsealed decades later, they transformed into legends, not just of what was done, but what was thought about being done. And sometimes imagination alone is enough to reshape history. Historians still argue where the line is. Did the exploding seashell plan ever get a budget code? Was it ever approved for deployment? Or was it some agent's late-night doodle meant to lighten a meeting filed away and forgotten until it wasn't? The records are muddy. Some documents say the shell was a prototype. Others suggest it was never built. No photos exist. No agent has publicly claimed authorship. But its existence as an idea is undeniable. It's right there in the declassified annals wedged between poison pills and mind control schemes, and that makes it real enough to matter. Because the Cold War, as much as it was a conflict of nations, was also a war of absurdity, of extremes, of state-sanctioned cartoons disguised as strategic policy. And maybe that's the most telling part. When empires get scared, they don't always build walls. Sometimes they build jokes. Accidental ones. Exploding seashells. Hallucinogenic handshakes. Ballpoint pens that double as hypodermic needles. You sit back now, hearing the waves crash quietly in the distance of memory. The story's almost over. You've followed Fidel through jungle and parliament, underwater and over airwaves. You've walked through CIA corridors and flipped through folders thicker than your pillow. And you realize something in the end: none of it worked. Not the toxins, not the scandals, not even the shell with a death wish. What worked? Survival. Reinvention. Laughing in the face of death, until even death got tired and walked away. You can picture it now, Castro on a reef somewhere near Varadero, surfacing from a dive. He removes his mask, he wipes his face. A bodyguard hands him a towel, and somewhere nearby, unnoticed, lies a shell. Bright, decorative, untouched, and entirely, completely silent. Now you feel the weight of the final waves, slow and steady, as the Cold War chapter closes. The sun sets on the era of plots so wild they seem pulled from the fever dreams of bureaucrats and spy novelists alike. But the legacy, that's the real treasure, left on the ocean floor. The CIA's obsession with Fidel Castro, with assassinating him by any means, even exploding seashells, reflects a period when paranoia and power tangled in ways that shaped the modern world. They spent millions, sacrificed credibility, and tried just about everything short of diplomacy. And yet their target remained untouchable, alive, and ever smiling. What lingers isn't just the plots, but the stories they spawned. Stories that endure like a coral reef of Cold War history, colorful, sharp, and teeming with life. These tales reveal a paradox, a superpower brought low by its own hubris and a revolutionary elevated by his survival and storytelling. Historians continue to debate just how serious some of these plots were. Was the exploding seashell ever more than a fanciful idea? Did it represent genuine intent or the desperation of men outmatched by their quarry? No consensus exists, but that uncertainty only deepens the legend. You feel yourself drifting now, the ocean's hush, filling your ears. Imagine the sea's soft pulse, the distant call of seabirds, the gentle swaying of coral gardens, where once an explosive device might have waited. The world moved on, but the seashell remains a symbol of an era when geopolitics played out not only in boardrooms and battlefields, but in the strangest corners of imagination. And you now have heard the tale of spies who weaponized nature, of a beard that outlasted 1,000 plots, and of a man who survived not just by power, but by becoming a legend. As your eyes grow heavy, remember history isn't just facts. It's stories. Stories of hope, failure, obsession, and sometimes absurdity. And sometimes it's about an exploding seashell that never exploded. So now, dim the lights a little more. Let the waves whisper softly in your mind. Let the weight of history settle like a lullaby. Sleep well, sweet dreams.